The emergency room at St. Mary's General Hospital buzzed with its usual chaos on that rainy Thursday evening. Nurses rushed between curtained areas, doctors shouted orders across the floor, and the constant beeping of monitors created a symphony of medical urgency. Among the controlled pandemonium, nobody paid much attention to the woman sitting quietly in the corner of the waiting area. Sarah Martinez had been waiting for 3 hours. Her right arm hung at an awkward angle, clearly broken, while dried blood matted her dark hair where a gash ran from her temple to her ear. Her clothes were torn and dirty, bearing the unmistakable signs of someone who had been living rough on the streets. The other patients gave her a wide berth, some covering their noses as they passed, others simply looking away in disgust. Dr. Richard Pemberton, the chief of emergency medicine, barely glanced in Sarah's direction as he reviewed charts at the nurse's station. At 55, he had built his reputation on efficiency and results, not on coddling what he privately referred to as frequent flyers, the homeless, addicted, and mentally ill who cycled through his emergency room like a revolving door. His expensive suit jacket hung neatly on his chair, and his silver hair was perfectly styled despite the long shift. "Next case?" he asked Nurse Patricia Williams, a 20-year veteran who had seen every type of patient imaginable walk through those doors. "Room 3 is chest pain, possible heart attack. Room 5 is a car accident victim, multiple lacerations. And then there's—" Patricia paused, glancing toward the waiting area. "The woman who's been waiting since 6. Obvious fracture, head wound. But she's homeless," Pemberton finished, not looking up from his clipboard. "How many times has she been in this month?" "This is actually her first visit, doctor. I've never seen her before." Pemberton finally looked toward Sarah, taking in her appearance with a practiced eye that had learned to make quick judgments. The torn jacket that might once have been military surplus, the worn boots that had walked countless miles, the way she held herself with a strange combination of alertness and resignation. To him, she looked like every other street person who wandered in seeking drugs, a warm bed, or simply a place to escape the weather. "Probable drug-seeking behavior," he muttered, making a note. "Get her some basic pain medication and a bandage for the head wound. The arm can wait until we clear the real emergencies." Patricia frowned. "Doctor, that arm looks seriously fractured, and the head wound might need stitches." "Nurse Williams, I've been doing this for 25 years. I can tell the difference between a genuine emergency and someone looking for their next fix. Deal with the bleeding, give her some ibuprofen, and move on. We have paying patients who need our attention." The young resident, Dr. James Chun, overheard the conversation as he approached the nurse's station. Fresh out of medical school, he still carried the idealism that made him believe every patient deserved the same level of care, regardless of their appearance or insurance status. "Maybe I could take a look at her," he suggested tentatively. "I have a few minutes before my next patient." Pemberton's expression hardened. "Dr. Chun, you need to learn to prioritize. That woman has probably been in 6 different emergency rooms this week, telling the same sob story, looking for narcotics. Don't waste your time or mine." "But her injuries look like exactly what you'd expect from someone who spends their nights in alleys and under bridges. Focus on medicine, not social work." Meanwhile, Sarah continued to wait, her jaw clenched against the pain that radiated from her arm with every heartbeat. She had been in worse situations, much worse, but the casual dismissal and obvious disgust from the hospital staff stirred something deep inside her that she had learned to keep carefully controlled. She watched the medical personnel move efficiently around her, noting their body language, their hierarchies, the way they communicated with each other in the shorthand of professionals. The pain in her arm was significant, but manageable. She had endured far worse during her 8 years of active duty, including the IED explosion in Afghanistan that had ended her military career and started her on the path that led to this moment. What bothered her more than the physical discomfort was the familiar sensation of being invisible, of being judged, and found wanting by people who had never lived a single day in her world. A young mother with a crying infant was ushered immediately to the front of the line, followed by an elderly man clutching his chest. Sarah understood medical triage. She had been trained in battlefield medicine herself, but she also recognized the difference between medical priority and social bias. The businessman who had arrived an hour after her, complaining of stomach pain that was likely nothing more than too much rich food and stress, had already been seen and discharged. Dr. Susan Rodriguez, the hospital's social worker, noticed Sarah during her evening rounds. Unlike the medical staff, Susan's job was specifically to see the people others overlooked, to advocate for patients who couldn't advocate for themselves. She approached Sarah with the gentle manner that had made her effective in her role for over a decade. "Hi there," Susan said, taking the seat next to Sarah. "I'm Susan Rodriguez. I work here at the hospital. How long have you been waiting?" Sarah looked at her with eyes that held depths Susan couldn't immediately fathom. 3.5 hours. That's too long for injuries like yours. Have you been seen at all? A nurse looked at me briefly. Said someone would be with me soon. Sarah's voice was steady, controlled, with just a hint of an accent that Susan couldn't quite place. Susan studied Sarah more carefully. Despite her obvious distress and apparent homelessness, there was something about her posture, her alertness, the way her eyes constantly scanned the room that seemed inconsistent with the typical presentation of chronic homeless individuals she usually encountered. "What happened to you?" Susan asked gently. Sarah was quiet for a long moment, as if deciding how much to reveal. "Fell down some stairs. Hit my head, landed wrong on my arm." It was technically true, though it left out the part about the 3 men who had cornered her in the abandoned building where she had been sheltering, demanding money she didn't have. It left out the fight that followed, and how she had managed to get away only after demonstrating skills that had surprised her attackers as much as herself. It left out the part where she had chosen the stairs over letting them lay their hands on her. "Do you have somewhere safe to stay tonight?" Susan asked. "I'll figure something out." Susan made a note to follow up, but she was interrupted by Dr. Pemberton's voice booming across the emergency room. "Rodriguez, we need you in room 7. Domestic violence case." As Susan hurried away, promising to return, Sarah was left alone again with her thoughts and her pain. She watched the controlled chaos of the emergency room with the trained eye of someone who had been responsible for the lives of others in crisis situations. She could see the inefficiencies, the personality conflicts, the way ego and prejudice affected medical decisions. The night shift was arriving, bringing fresh energy but also fresh attitudes. Nurse Jennifer Morrison, a Navy veteran herself, couldn't help but notice the woman in the corner who sat with the unmistakable bearing of someone with military training. Something about Sarah's posture, the way she held her injured arm, the alertness in her eyes despite obvious pain, triggered Jennifer's recognition. "Hey," Jennifer said, approaching Sarah. "I'm Jennifer. I just started my shift. How are you holding up?" "I've been better," Sarah replied. And, for the first time that evening, she allowed a small smile to cross her face. Something about Jennifer's approach was different, more direct, more respectful. "Let me take a look at that arm," Jennifer said, gently examining the injury with practiced hands. "This needs immediate attention. The swelling suggests a complex fracture, and you need X-rays right away." Jennifer's assessment was overheard by Dr. Pemberton, who had been trying to clear the waiting room before the end of his shift. His irritation was obvious as he approached them. "Nurse Morrison, I've already evaluated this patient. Basic pain management and wound care is sufficient. We don't need to tie up radiology for obvious drug-seeking behavior." Jennifer's expression hardened. As a Navy veteran who had served 2 tours in Iraq, she recognized something in Sarah that the other staff had missed. "With respect, Doctor, this injury pattern isn't consistent with drug-seeking behavior. The mechanism of injury suggests significant trauma, and the patient's presentation indicates someone with a high pain tolerance." "Nurse Morrison, I don't need lectures on emergency medicine from someone who's been here all of 2 months. That woman is homeless, probably addicted, and definitely not our priority." The exchange was attracting attention from other staff members. Dr. Chun, who had been observing from across the room, approached with renewed interest. The young resident had been troubled by the earlier dismissal and was curious about Nurse Morrison's obviously different assessment. "What makes you think this is more serious?" Dr. Chun asked Jennifer quietly. Jennifer glanced at Sarah, who was listening to the conversation with an expression that revealed nothing. "Look at her posture. Look at her breathing pattern. Look at the way she's managing pain that would have most people crying or demanding medication. This isn't someone seeking drugs. This is someone who's been trained to deal with serious trauma. Trained how? Before Jennifer could answer, Sarah spoke for the first time since the medical staff had begun debating her case. Her voice was calm, steady, and carried a tone of authority that made everyone within earshot stop what they were doing. I think I'll seek treatment elsewhere. She began to stand, moving carefully but with obvious determination. The simple act of rising to her feet despite her injuries demonstrated a level of physical discipline and pain tolerance that finally got Dr. Pemberton's full attention. "Wait," Dr. Chin said quickly. "Please don't leave. Let me at least examine you properly." Sarah looked at him for a long moment, then at Jennifer, then at Dr. Pemberton. The emergency room had grown quieter, with several staff members now openly watching the interaction. Something in the dynamics had shifted, though most of them couldn't quite identify what. "I've been waiting for nearly 4 hours," Sarah said quietly. "I've been dismissed, ignored, and prejudged. I've been treated like a problem rather than a patient. I think I can manage without that kind of help." The words were spoken without anger or self-pity, but with a quiet dignity that made several of the staff members uncomfortable. Dr. Pemberton found himself looking more carefully at the woman he had so quickly categorized and dismissed. "You're right," Jennifer said suddenly. "You shouldn't have to put up with that. But you also shouldn't have to suffer with a broken arm because some people can't see past their own prejudices." The rebuke was subtle but clear, and it hung in the air as Sarah considered her options. The pain in her arm was intensifying, and she knew that trying to treat a complex fracture without proper medical care could lead to permanent damage. But she also knew that accepting treatment here meant subjecting herself to continued judgment and substandard care. The standoff might have continued indefinitely, but it was interrupted by the arrival of someone who would change everything. Dr. Michael Torres, the hospital's chief of staff, making his regular evening rounds. A former Army medic himself, Torres had built his medical career on the principle that every patient deserved dignity and excellent care, regardless of their circumstances. Torres immediately sensed the tension in the emergency room and approached the group with the easy authority of someone accustomed to resolving conflicts. "What's the situation here?" he asked, his voice carrying the kind of calm command that made people want to explain themselves clearly. Dr. Pemberton straightened, suddenly, aware that his handling of the situation might not reflect well on his professional judgment. "Dr. Torres, we have a homeless patient with minor injuries. Nurse Morrison and Dr. Chin seem to think we should prioritize her over more serious cases." Torres looked at Sarah, taking in her appearance, but also noting details that others had missed. The way she carried herself, the alertness in her eyes, the controlled way she managed her obvious pain. His experienced I saw something familiar, something that triggered memories of soldiers he had treated in field hospitals overseas. "What are your injuries?" Torres asked Sarah directly. "Broken arm, possible concussion, various cuts, and bruises," Sarah replied, her voice steady. "How did this happen?" Sarah met his gaze directly. "I fell down some stairs while avoiding a confrontation." Torres heard what she said, but, more importantly, he heard what she didn't say. The careful phrasing, the way she described avoiding a confrontation rather than running from a fight, the matter-of-fact tone when discussing injuries that would have most people demanding immediate attention. "Dr. Chun," Torres said, never taking his eyes off Sarah, "please escort this patient to room 1 immediately. I want full x-rays, CT scan of her head, and a complete trauma workup." "Dr. Torres," Pemberton began. "I really think you're—" "Dr. Pemberton," Torres interrupted, his voice carrying a warning. "This is no longer a discussion." As Dr. Chin gently guided Sarah toward room 1, Torres turned to face the emergency room staff, who had been watching the drama unfold. His expression made it clear that this was a teaching moment they would not soon forget. "Let me be very clear," he said, his voice carrying to every corner of the room. "In this hospital, every patient receives the same standard of care. Every patient is treated with dignity and respect. Anyone who cannot maintain those standards needs to seriously reconsider whether they belong in medicine." The rebuke was delivered calmly, but its impact was unmistakable. Dr. Pemberton's face reddened as he realized his handling of the situation had been publicly criticized by his superior. Several other staff members suddenly found urgent business elsewhere in the emergency room. In room 1, Sarah finally received the medical attention she had been seeking. Dr. Chin's examination revealed the extent of her injuries: a complex fracture of the radius that would require surgical repair, a concussion that needed monitoring, and several deep lacerations that required careful cleaning and suturing. "This is going to need surgery," Dr. Chun explained as they reviewed the x-rays. "The fracture is displaced, and there are bone fragments that need to be properly aligned. Without surgery, you could lose significant function in that arm." Sarah nodded, unsurprised. She had suspected the injury was serious from the moment it happened, but she had also learned not to expect immediate medical care. Her experiences since leaving the military had taught her that people like her, people without homes, without insurance, without obvious value to society, were often treated as disposable. "How soon?" she asked. "We can get you into surgery tonight if you consent. Dr. Harrison is one of our best orthopedic surgeons." For the first time since arriving at the hospital, Sarah felt something like relief. Finally, someone was treating her injury with the seriousness it deserved. Finally, someone was looking past her appearance to see the person underneath. As Dr. Chun prepared the surgical consent forms, Sarah closed her eyes and allowed herself to remember a different time, when she had worn a uniform that commanded respect, when her skills had been valued, when she had been somebody that mattered. She thought about the mission that had gone wrong, the explosion that had changed everything, the long journey from decorated Navy SEAL to homeless veteran that had brought her to this moment. The irony wasn't lost on her. These people had almost denied her care because they couldn't see past her circumstances to recognize her worth. They had no idea that the woman they had dismissed as worthless had once been entrusted with classified missions, had saved American lives in hostile territory, had served her country with distinction and honor. But, perhaps, Sarah thought as the pre-surgical medications began to take effect, it was better that they didn't know. Perhaps it was better to be judged on her humanity rather than her history, even if that judgment had initially failed her so completely. The last thing Sarah remembered before the anesthesia took hold was Nurse Jennifer's voice. Sarah woke up in the recovery room to the sound of steady beeping monitors and the soft murmur of voices. Her arm was immobilized in a fresh cast, and the throbbing pain in her head had subsided to a dull ache. For a moment, she forgot where she was, her mind still foggy from the anesthesia. Then, the events of the previous evening came flooding back: the confrontation in the abandoned building, the long wait in the emergency room, the dismissive treatment from the medical staff. "Good morning," a gentle voice said. Sarah turned to see Nurse Jennifer adjusting her foreline. "Surgery went very well. Dr. Harrison said the fracture was more complex than initially thought, but she was able to repair everything. You should have full function once it heals." Sarah nodded, testing her voice. "How long was I out?" "About 4 hours for surgery, then another 6 in recovery. It's almost noon now." Jennifer checked Sarah's vital signs with practiced efficiency. "How's your pain level?" "Manageable," Sarah replied automatically, then caught herself. After years of military conditioning to downplay injuries and push through pain, admitting discomfort had become almost impossible. "Actually, it hurts quite a bit." Jennifer smiled. "That's what pain medication is for. There's no medal for suffering unnecessarily." She made an adjustment to the 4, and Sarah felt the edge of pain begin to fade. "Dr. Torres wants to see you when you're feeling up to it." The mention of Dr. Torres brought back memories of the previous evening. He had been the one to finally insist she receive proper treatment, the one who had overruled Dr. Pemberton's dismissal. Sarah wondered what he wanted to discuss. In her experience, when authority figures wanted to talk, it usually meant complications. "Is there a problem?" "No problem," Jennifer assured her. "He just wanted to check on you personally. He does that sometimes with patients who've had a particularly rough time in the ER." Rough time. Sarah almost smiled at the understatement. She had faced enemy fire, survived IED explosions, completed missions that most people couldn't imagine, but somehow being dismissed and ignored in a hospital waiting room had felt like one of the most dehumanizing experiences of her life. Dr. Torres arrived 20 minutes later, carrying a cup of coffee and wearing the same calm, authoritative presence Sarah remembered from the night before. He pulled up a chair beside her bed, a gesture that immediately set him apart from the other doctors she had encountered. How are you feeling, Ms. Martinez? Sarah was surprised he knew her name. During the previous night's chaos, she didn't remember anyone asking for or using it. Better. Thank you for intervening last night. I owe you an apology, Torres said directly. The treatment you received in our emergency room fell far below the standards we expect from our staff. That should never have happened. Sarah studied his face, looking for the polite insincerity she had learned to expect from authority figures, but found only genuine concern. It's not your fault. Actually, it is. I'm responsible for the culture and standards in this hospital. When patients are treated poorly because of their appearance or perceived social status, that's a failure of leadership. Torres leaned forward slightly. Can you tell me exactly what happened last night? I want to understand the full scope of what went wrong. For the next 15 minutes, Sarah recounted the events of the previous evening in careful, precise detail. She had learned in the military to give clear, factual reports, and she applied those skills now, describing not just what happened but the tone, the body language, the casual dismissal that had characterized most of her interactions with the hospital staff. Torres listened without interruption, his expression growing increasingly troubled. When Sarah finished, he was quiet for a long moment. I've scheduled a mandatory meeting for all emergency room staff for this afternoon, he said finally. What happened to you is going to be a case study in how not to treat patients. With your permission, I'd like to use your experience to help ensure this doesn't happen to anyone else. Sarah considered the request. Part of her wanted to simply heal and move on, to avoid any more attention or scrutiny. But another part, the part that had been trained to serve something larger than herself, recognized the opportunity to make a difference. You have my permission, she said. Thank you. Torres stood to leave, then paused. Nurse Morrison mentioned she thought you might have military experience. Were you in the service? The question hung in the air between them. Sarah had been dreading this moment, when someone would start to dig into her background, when her carefully constructed anonymity would begin to crumble. She had learned that being known as a veteran brought its own complications, sometimes excessive gratitude that felt hollow, sometimes suspicion about what had gone wrong to leave her homeless. Always questions she wasn't ready to answer. Navy, she said simply. How long? 8 years. Torres nodded slowly. Combat. Sarah met his gaze. Yes. Thank you for your service. Torres said it without the elaborate ceremony that often accompanied such statements, making it sound genuine rather than performative. The VA has excellent programs for veterans dealing with housing issues. I can have our social worker connect you with resources. I've tried the VA, Sarah said quietly. It's complicated. Torres heard something in her tone that made him study her more carefully. After years of treating veterans, he had learned to recognize the signs of someone carrying burdens that went beyond simple unemployment or housing problems. Ms. Martinez, may I speak frankly? Sarah nodded. In my experience, when decorated combat veterans end up homeless, it's usually because the system has failed them, not because they've failed the system. Whatever brought you to this point, it doesn't diminish your worth or your right to be treated with dignity. The words hit Sarah harder than she expected. For months, she had internalized the looks of disgust and dismissal she received daily, had begun to believe that perhaps she really was as worthless as society seemed to consider her. Hearing someone in authority acknowledge that her circumstances didn't define her value was unexpectedly powerful. I appreciate that, she managed to say. After Torres left, Sarah lay in the hospital bed staring at the ceiling, wrestling with thoughts and memories she had spent months trying to suppress. The pain medication made her defenses weaker, allowing emotions she had carefully buried to surface. She thought about Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez, the Navy SEAL who had earned a Bronze Star for valor in Afghanistan. She thought about the woman who had led successful missions behind enemy lines, who had been trusted with the lives of her team members, who had been on track for promotion to full commander before everything went wrong. The incident that ended her career hadn't been dramatic or heroic. No enemy fire, no life-or-death decision that haunted her dreams. Instead, it had been a simple training accident, an equipment malfunction during a routine parachute jump that sent her careening into a rocky outcrop. The physical injuries had healed within months, but the traumatic brain injury had been more insidious. The headaches came first, then the memory problems, then the difficulty processing complex information that had once come as naturally as breathing. The Navy doctors were understanding, but clear. She could no longer perform the duties required of a SEAL. Medical retirement was presented as an honorable option, a chance to transition to civilian life with full benefits and support. What they hadn't prepared her for was how completely her identity would unravel without the structure and purpose that had defined her adult life. The civilian world seemed alien and meaningless after years of high-stakes missions. The therapy sessions felt like elaborate exercises in futility. The job retraining programs were designed for people who wanted conventional lives, not for someone who had spent 8 years living on the edge of existence. The descent had been gradual, but relentless. First, the apartment became too expensive without steady employment. Then, the car was repossessed when the savings ran out. Then, the bureaucratic maze of benefits and services became too complex to navigate with a brain that no longer processed information the way it once had. The worst part hadn't been the physical hardships of homelessness, though those were considerable. The worst part had been the invisibility, the way people looked through her as if she didn't exist, the casual cruelty of a society that had no use for someone who couldn't contribute in recognized ways. Dr. Chin knocked softly on the door frame before entering, interrupting Sarah's painful reverie. The young resident looked nervous but determined, carrying a chart and wearing an expression of barely controlled anxiety. "Ms. Martinez, I wanted to apologize for last night. I should have insisted on examining you properly regardless of what anyone else said." Sarah studied the young doctor's face. She could see genuine remorse there, along with something else, a recognition that he had compromised his own principles in deference to authority and convenience. "You were following orders from your superior," Sarah said. "That's what you're supposed to do." "No," Chin said firmly. "I became a doctor to help people, not to follow orders that prevent me from helping people. What happened last night? It's not who I want to be as a physician." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Dr. Pemberton, who entered the room with the air of someone fulfilling an unpleasant obligation. His expression suggested he was there under duress rather than genuine concern. "Ms. Martinez," Pemberton said stiffly, "I wanted to check on your progress and ensure you're receiving appropriate care." Sarah could read between the lines. Dr. Torres had clearly spoken to Pemberton about the previous night's incident, and this visit was damage control rather than medical concern. "The care has been excellent," Sarah replied diplomatically. "Dr. Harrison did beautiful work on the surgery." Pemberton nodded, clearly relieved that she wasn't planning to file a complaint or make further trouble. Good. And our social worker will be able to connect you with appropriate resources for your situation." The pause before situation spoke volumes about Pemberton's continued discomfort with treating homeless patients. Sarah could see that his fundamental attitudes hadn't changed. He was simply going through the motions required by his supervisor. "Actually," Dr. Chin interjected, "I'd like to follow up on Ms. Martinez's case personally. Her injuries were more complex than initially assessed, and I think continued monitoring would be appropriate." Pemberton looked surprised by the young resident's initiative. "That's not really necessary for this type of case. Our discharge planning staff can handle routine follow-up." "I'd prefer to handle it myself," Chin said, and Sarah could hear the steel beneath his polite tone. Given the initial misdiagnosis, the word misdiagnosis hung in the air like an accusation. Pemberton's face reddened as he realized that Chun was creating a paper trail that might reflect poorly on his professional judgment. "Very well," Pemberton said tersely. "Just ensure you document everything properly." After Pemberton left, Chin turned back to Sarah with an expression of quiet determination. "I meant what I said about follow-up care. You shouldn't have to worry about getting proper medical attention because of anyone's prejudices." Sarah felt something she hadn't experienced in months, a sense that someone in authority actually cared about her welfare. It was a small thing, but after so many experiences of dismissal and judgment, small kindnesses felt enormous. "Thank you," she said simply. As the afternoon wore on, Sarah received a steady stream of visitors. Nurse Jennifer stopped by during her break to check on her personally. Social worker Susan Rodriguez arrived with information about veteran services and transitional housing programs. Even Dr. Harrison, the surgeon, made an unexpected appearance to review the post-operative instructions personally. The attention was both gratifying and uncomfortable. Sarah had become accustomed to invisibility, and being seen again, really seen, as a person worthy of concern and care, felt overwhelming. She found herself wondering how long it would last, how long before these people moved on to other patients, and forgot about the homeless woman they had briefly rescued. Late in the afternoon, Torres returned with news that would change everything. "Ms. Martinez, I've had an interesting conversation with our hospital administrator about your case," he began. "We're implementing some new training protocols around patient dignity and unconscious bias, and we're looking for someone with the right background to help develop and deliver those programs." Sarah listened carefully, trying to understand where the conversation was heading. The position would be part-time initially, working with our staff education department. The pay isn't enormous, but it comes with health insurance and enough income to secure stable housing. Sarah stared at Torres, certain she had misunderstood. "You're offering me a job? I'm offering you an opportunity to help ensure that what happened to you never happens to anyone else. Your military background gives you credibility with our staff, and your recent experience gives you insight into what patients go through when the system fails them." For a long moment, Sarah couldn't speak. The offer seemed impossible, too good to be true. After months of rejection and dismissal, someone was not only acknowledging her value but asking her to use her experiences to help others. "I don't have an address," she said finally. "No permanent housing, no references, no civilian work history. We'll work all that out," Torres assured her. "The hospital has partnerships with transitional housing programs for exactly these situations. What I need to know is whether you're interested in the work." Sarah thought about the woman she had been, Lieutenant Commander Martinez, trusted with classified missions and the lives of her team. She thought about the woman she had become, invisible, dismissed, treated as if her life had no value. And she thought about the woman she might become again, someone who could make a difference, who could use her experiences to help others avoid the pain she had endured. "Yes," she said. "I'm very interested." Torres smiled. "Excellent. We'll start the paperwork tomorrow. But, for now, you need to focus on healing. The cast comes off in 6 weeks, and we want you fully recovered before you start work." As Torres left, Sarah lay back in her hospital bed feeling something she hadn't experienced in months: hope. Not just for herself, but for the possibility that her suffering might serve a purpose, that the knowledge she had gained from being dismissed and devalued might help ensure others didn't experience the same treatment. 6 weeks later, Sarah stood outside the main entrance of St. Mary's General Hospital, wearing clothes that actually fit, and looking more like the professional she was about to become than the desperate woman who had been dismissed in their emergency room. The transitional housing program had provided her with a small but clean apartment, and the advance on her salary had allowed her to purchase appropriate clothing for her new role. The cast had come off 3 days earlier, revealing an arm that worked perfectly thanks to Dr. Harrison's skilled surgery. Sarah flexed her fingers, testing the range of motion that might never have returned if she had been forced to leave the hospital that night without proper treatment. The irony wasn't lost on her. The same institution that had initially rejected her was now giving her a chance to rebuild her life. Dr. Torres met her at the information desk, looking pleased to see the transformation in her appearance and demeanor. Gone was the defeated posture and hollow expression of 6 weeks ago. In their place was the bearing of someone who had found purpose again. "Ready for your first day?" Torres asked as they headed toward the elevator. "Ready," Sarah confirmed. She had spent the past weeks preparing for this opportunity, researching best practices in medical education, studying literature on unconscious bias in healthcare, and planning the curriculum she would help develop. Their first stop was the Human Resources Department, where Sarah completed the final paperwork for her employment. The HR director, Mrs. Patricia Chun, Dr. Chin's mother, as it turned out, was warm and welcoming, treating Sarah with the same professional courtesy she would show any new employee. "We're excited to have you join our team," Mrs. Chun said as she handed Sarah her employee identification badge. "Dr. Torres has told us wonderful things about your background and the perspective you'll bring to our training programs." Sarah clipped the badge to her jacket, feeling a surge of pride at the official recognition of her place in the organization. It had been over a year since she had carried identification that connected her to anything meaningful, and the simple plastic badge felt like a symbol of her return to relevance. From HR, Torres took her on a tour of the hospital, introducing her to department heads and key staff members. Sarah noticed the mix of reactions to her presence. Some people were clearly curious about the new training coordinator who had emerged from such unusual circumstances, while others seemed uncomfortable with her background as a formerly homeless patient. Dr. Pemberton was notably absent from the introductions, though Sarah spotted him once during their tour, observing from a distance with an expression she couldn't quite read. Torres had mentioned that Pemberton's handling of her case had become part of his performance review, and that the chief of emergency medicine was not pleased about having his professional judgment questioned. "There's something you should know," Torres said as they walked toward the staff education department. "Not everyone is thrilled about your hiring. Some people see it as the administration making a political statement rather than a practical decision." Sarah had expected as much. In her military experience, any change that challenged established ways of doing things met with resistance from those comfortable with the status quo. "Are you having second thoughts?" she asked. "Not at all," Torres replied firmly. "But I want you to be prepared for the fact that you'll need to prove yourself to some people who have already decided you don't belong here." They arrived at the education department, where Sarah was introduced to Director Margaret Walsh, a veteran educator who had been running the hospital's training programs for over 15 years. Walsh was professional but reserved, clearly withholding judgment about the unconventional new addition to her team. Ms. Martinez will be working primarily on our patient dignity and cultural competency initiatives, Torres explained. Given her background, she brings a unique perspective to these issues. Walsh nodded politely. "I've prepared an office for you," she said to Sarah. "We can discuss your specific responsibilities once you've had a chance to settle in." Sarah's office was small but functional, with a desk, computer, and filing cabinet. On the desk was a stack of materials Walsh had prepared: previous training curricula, hospital policies on patient rights, and research papers on bias in medical settings. Sarah sat down and began reviewing the materials, already forming ideas about how to improve the existing programs. Her first official meeting was scheduled for that afternoon with a committee of department heads who would help guide the development of the new training initiatives. Sarah spent the morning preparing, drawing on her military experience with briefings and presentations to organize her thoughts into clear, actionable recommendations. The conference room was packed when Sarah arrived, with representatives from emergency medicine, surgery, nursing, social work, and hospital administration. She recognized several faces from her time as a patient, including Dr. Chun, who gave her an encouraging smile, and Nurse Jennifer, who nodded approvingly. Torres made the introductions and explained the context for the meeting. "As many of you know, we recently had an incident in our emergency room that highlighted some serious deficiencies in how we treat certain patient populations. Ms. Martinez experienced these deficiencies firsthand, and she's here to help us do better." Sarah stood to address the group, drawing on years of military briefings to project confidence and authority. "Thank you all for taking the time to be here. I'd like to start by sharing some statistics that might surprise you." She clicked to her first slide, which showed national data on patient experiences in emergency rooms. Studies show that homeless patients wait an average of 4 times longer for treatment than insured patients with identical injuries. LGBTQ patients report discrimination in 60% of their healthcare encounters. Patients of color are significantly less likely to receive appropriate pain medication. The room was quiet as Sarah continued with more statistics, painting a picture of systematic bias that affected patient outcomes across all demographics. She watched the faces around the table, noting who seemed engaged and who appeared defensive. "The research is clear," Sarah continued, "that unconscious bias in healthcare isn't just a moral issue. It's a quality issue that affects patient outcomes and exposes hospitals to liability." Dr. Pemberton, who had arrived late and taken a seat in the back, raised his hand. "Ms. Martinez, with respect, these statistics represent national averages. They don't necessarily reflect the quality of care we provide here at St. Mary's." Sarah looked directly at him. "Dr. Pemberton, You're right that national statistics don't tell us everything about our specific institution. That's why I'd like to share some data that's more relevant to our discussion. She clicked to the next slide, which showed Sarah's own medical record from the night she was a patient. The timeline was damning. Nearly 4 hours between arrival and proper assessment, multiple opportunities for intervention that were missed, and detailed documentation of the dismissive treatment she had received. "This is my medical record from 6 weeks ago," Sarah said calmly. "Dr. Pemberton, you documented that I was exhibiting probable drug-seeking behavior despite having no medical evidence to support that assessment. You ordered basic pain medication and delayed treatment for what turned out to be a complex fracture requiring surgical repair." The silence in the room was profound. Several people shifted uncomfortably in their seats, while others looked directly at Pemberton, whose face had turned red. "If I had left the hospital that night, as I nearly did, I would likely have permanent disability in my right arm. Not because of the severity of my injury, but because medical professionals made assumptions about my worth based on my appearance." Sarah paused, letting the weight of her words settle over the room. When she continued, her tone was measured but firm. "I'm not here to embarrass anyone or to assign blame for past mistakes. I'm here because we have an opportunity to ensure this never happens again, to any patient, for any reason." Dr. Walsh, the head of internal medicine, leaned forward. "What specific changes are you recommending?" Sarah clicked to her next slide, which outlined a comprehensive training program. First, mandatory bias recognition training for all clinical staff, updated annually. Second, standardized triage protocols that focus on medical presentation rather than social factors. Third, patient advocacy systems that provide oversight when vulnerable populations seek care. She continued through her recommendations, each one backed by research and tied to specific policies the hospital could implement. Her presentation was thorough, professional, and impossible to dismiss as the complaints of a disgruntled former patient. When Sarah finished, Torres opened the floor for questions. Dr. Chun was the first to speak. "This is exactly the kind of systematic approach we need. How quickly can we begin implementation?" "I'd recommend a pilot program in the emergency department," Sarah replied. "We can test the new protocols there and refine them before rolling out hospital-wide." Nurse Jennifer raised her hand. "What about ongoing support for staff who are struggling with these issues? Some of the bias isn't intentional. People just need help recognizing their own blind spots." "Excellent point," Sarah said. "Part of the program includes peer mentoring and regular debriefing sessions where staff can discuss challenging cases and get feedback on their approach." The questions continued for another 30 minutes, with most participants showing genuine engagement with Sarah's proposals. Dr. Pemberton remained notably quiet throughout the discussion, leaving immediately after Torres adjourned the meeting. As the room emptied, Dr. Torres approached Sarah with a satisfied expression. "That was impressive. You handled Pemberton's challenge perfectly, professional but firm." "I had good training in handling hostile audiences," Sarah replied. "Military briefings prepared me for worse than that." Torres paused, studying Sarah's face. "You've never told me specifically what your military role was." "I know you were Navy, but what was your specialty?" Sarah had been dreading this question, knowing it would come eventually. Her military record was classified enough that casual research wouldn't reveal the details, but Torres had the authority and connections to dig deeper if he chose to. "Special operations," she said simply. "How special?" Sarah met his gaze directly. "Navy SEALs. I was a lieutenant commander when I was medically retired." Torres stared at her for a long moment, clearly recalibrating his understanding of who he had hired. "You were a SEAL." "Yes." "A SEAL officer." "Yes. And we almost turned you away from our emergency room because you looked homeless." Sarah nodded. "That's exactly why this training program is necessary. If you judge people by their circumstances rather than their worth, you miss seeing who they really are." Torres shook his head slowly. "Ms. Martinez, I thought I understood what happened that night, but I'm beginning to realize I only saw the surface of it." Word of Sarah's military background spread through the hospital with remarkable speed. By the end of her first week, she noticed a definite change in how staff members interacted with her. Some approached her with newfound respect, clearly impressed by her SEAL credentials. Others seemed intimidated, unsure how to relate to someone with her background. The change was most pronounced in the emergency room, where her presence had become something of a legend. Nurses who had dismissed her as worthless now spoke to her with deference that bordered on the excessive. Residents sought her out for advice, hoping to learn from someone with her unique combination of military and patient experience. Dr. Chun became one of her strongest supporters, helping her navigate hospital politics and offering insights into the clinical perspective on the changes she was proposing. During one of their planning sessions, he shared something that had been troubling him. "I keep thinking about that night," he said. "You were sitting right there in front of us, and we almost let you leave with an untreated fracture because we couldn't see past our own assumptions." "But you didn't," Sarah pointed out. "When it mattered, you spoke up. Not soon enough. And not strongly enough." Chin shook his head. "How many other people have we failed? How many patients have received substandard care because we made judgments based on appearance?" It was exactly the kind of soul-searching that Sarah hoped her program would encourage. The goal wasn't to shame healthcare providers, but to help them recognize their own humanity and fallibility. The pilot program launched 3 weeks later in the emergency room, with Sarah personally training the first group of nurses and residents. The sessions were interactive and challenging, using case studies and role-playing exercises to help participants recognize their own biases. Not everyone embraced the training enthusiastically. Dr. Pemberton attended the mandatory sessions but remained obviously skeptical, making pointed comments about political correctness and wasted resources. Some of the older nurses seemed to view the program as criticism of their decades of experience. But Sarah also saw encouraging signs of change. Younger staff members embraced the new protocols eagerly, grateful for tools that helped them provide better care to all patients. Some veteran nurses admitted privately that the training had helped them recognize problematic patterns in their own practice. The real test came during Sarah's second month on the job, when a situation arose that paralleled her own experience. A young Hispanic man arrived in the emergency room with obvious signs of injury, but his appearance and behavior suggested possible drug intoxication. Under the old protocols, he might have been dismissed or given minimal treatment. Instead, the new triage system required a full medical assessment regardless of social factors. The examination revealed not drug intoxication, but a serious head injury that required immediate intervention. The patient, as it turned out, was an honor student who had been assaulted while walking home from his job at a local restaurant. Dr. Chun, who had been the attending physician for the case, sought out Sarah afterward to share what had happened. "6 months ago, I might have made the same assumptions everyone made about you," he admitted. The training program probably saved that young man's life. Sarah felt a deep sense of satisfaction hearing that her work was already mown year after her first night as a patient in St. Mary's emergency room. Sarah Martinez stood before the American Hospital Association's annual conference, preparing to deliver the keynote address on patient dignity and healthcare equity. The irony of the moment wasn't lost on her. The woman who had once been dismissed as worthless was now sharing her expertise with healthcare leaders from across the nation. In the audience of over 2,000 medical professionals, she could see Dr. Torres, who had flown in specifically to hear her speak. Next to him sat Dr. Chun, who had become not just a colleague but a close friend and co-author on several research papers they had published about bias in emergency medicine. Even Dr. Pemberton had made the trip, having transformed from skeptic to one of Sarah's strongest advocates. "Distinguished colleagues," Sarah began, her voice carrying clearly through the conference hall. "I want to start with a question that might make some of you uncomfortable. How many patients have you dismissed this week without giving them the care they truly needed?" The question hung in the air, creating a palpable tension in the room. Sarah had learned that starting with discomfort was often the most effective way to capture attention and create openness to change. "I ask this question not to judge you, but because I know from personal experience how easy it is to make assumptions about patients based on their appearance, their social status, or their perceived ability to pay. 18 months ago, I was one of those patients you might have dismissed." Sarah clicked to her first slide, which showed a photo of herself from her Navy days. Crisp uniform, confident posture, the bearing of someone accustomed to command and respect. "This was me 5 years ago." Lieutenant Commander Sarah Martinez, United States Navy SEALs, with 8 years of active duty and a Bronze Star for valor in Afghanistan. She clicked to the next slide, showing the emergency room intake photo from the night she had been a patient at St. Mary's, disheveled, injured, bearing all the visible signs of homelessness. And this was me 18 months ago, waiting 4 hours for treatment of a complex fracture because medical professionals looked at my appearance and decided I wasn't worth their time or attention. The contrast between the images was striking, and Sarah could see the shock and recognition on faces throughout the audience. She had learned that showing rather than simply telling was the most effective way to communicate the reality of how quickly circumstances could change for anyone. Over the next 45 minutes, Sarah shared not just her personal story, but the systematic changes that had resulted from her experiences. She presented data showing how St. Mary's patient satisfaction scores had improved, how complaints about discriminatory treatment had virtually disappeared, and how staff turnover in the emergency department had decreased significantly. The changes we implemented weren't complicated or expensive, Sarah explained. They were based on one simple principle: treating every patient as if they were someone you cared about. Because they are. During the question and answer session that followed, Sarah fielded inquiries from hospital administrators, emergency room physicians, and nursing directors who wanted to implement similar programs at their own institutions. The enthusiasm was gratifying, but Sarah also recognized the challenges of changing institutional culture. One question came from a hospital CEO in Chicago. Ms. Martinez, how do you respond to critics who argue that focusing on patient dignity is a luxury that emergency rooms can't afford when they're dealing with genuine life and death situations? Sarah had faced this criticism many times, and she had developed a response based on both research and practical experience. Sir, with respect, I'd argue that patient dignity isn't a luxury. It's a necessity for providing quality medical care. When patients feel dismissed or devalued, they're less likely to provide accurate medical histories, less likely to follow treatment recommendations, and less likely to return for follow-up care. Poor communication and bias don't just hurt patients emotionally, they hurt them medically. She clicked to a slide showing statistics from St. Mary's emergency room. Since implementing our training programs, we've seen a 15% reduction in return visits for the same conditions, a 20% improvement in medication compliance, and a significant decrease in violent incidents. Treating patients with dignity isn't just the right thing to do, it's the effective thing to do. After her presentation, Sarah was approached by dozens of conference attendees who wanted to learn more about her programs. Among them was Dr. Elizabeth Warren, the chief medical officer of a large hospital system in California. Ms. Martinez, your story is remarkable, but I'm particularly interested in the practical aspects of implementation. How do you get buy-in from physicians who are resistant to change? Sarah smiled. Dr. Warren, I've found that most resistance comes from fear of being criticized, fear of additional workload, fear of admitting that current practices might be flawed. The key is to present the changes as improvements to medical practice, not criticisms of past behavior. Can you give me a specific example? Absolutely. When we introduced new triage protocols that required more comprehensive assessment of all patients, some emergency physicians were concerned about increased time requirements. But when they saw that the new protocols actually reduced the number of misdiagnoses and prevented costly liability issues, they embraced the changes enthusiastically. Dr. Warren nodded thoughtfully. And how do you handle situations where bias is deeply ingrained? Individual counseling, peer mentoring, and sometimes, frankly, personnel decisions. We found that most people can change when given the right tools and support. But we've also learned that a small percentage of staff members aren't willing to provide equitable care, and those individuals need to find other career paths. The conversation continued for another 20 minutes, with Dr. Warren taking careful notes about implementation strategies. She was one of several administrators who scheduled follow-up consultations with Sarah to help implement similar programs at their own institutions. Later that evening, at the conference dinner, Sarah found herself seated at the head table alongside some of the most respected names in American healthcare. The recognition felt surreal to someone who had spent months being invisible on the streets, but she had learned to accept the platform as an opportunity to advocate for vulnerable populations. Dr. Michael Rodriguez, the president of the American Hospital Association, introduced Sarah as the evening's honored guest. Ladies and gentlemen, Sarah Martinez represents the best of what our profession can be. Someone who transforms personal adversity into systematic improvement for all patients. The applause was genuine and sustained, but Sarah remained focused on the work rather than the recognition. During her brief remarks, she emphasized that real change required sustained commitment, not just good intentions. The test of our profession's commitment to equity won't be measured by the applause in rooms like this, Sarah said. It will be measured by how we treat the patient who arrives at 3 in the morning with no insurance, no address, and no one to advocate for them. That patient deserves the same quality of care as the most prominent member of your hospital's board of directors. After the dinner, Sarah returned to her hotel room and video called Dr. Torres, who wanted to hear how the presentation had been received. "Sarah, you should see the response on social media," Torres said, his excitement evident. "Healthcare professionals from around the country are sharing your presentation and asking about implementing similar programs. This could be the beginning of a national movement." Sarah was pleased by the response, but remained focused on practical outcomes. "Have we received any formal requests for consultation?" 17 hospitals so far, including 2 major medical centers and a Veterans Affairs facility. "The demand for your expertise is growing faster than we anticipated." They discussed the logistics of expanding Sarah's role to include national consulting while maintaining her responsibilities at St. Mary's. It was a good problem to have, but it required careful planning to ensure that her core mission wasn't compromised by success. The following morning, Sarah received a phone call that would prove to be one of the most meaningful of her new career. The caller identified himself as Admiral James Peterson, currently serving as the Navy's Surgeon General. "Commander Martinez," Admiral Peterson began, using Sarah's former military rank, "I attended your presentation yesterday, and I wanted to speak with you personally about your work." Sarah was surprised by the call and uncertain about its purpose. "Admiral, I'm honored by your attention." "Commander, I want you to know that your presentation has prompted some serious reflection within Navy Medical Services. We're realizing that our own treatment of veterans with service-related injuries and psychological trauma may not meet the standards you've articulated." 3 months into her new role, Sarah had established herself as an indispensable part of the hospital's operations. Her training programs were being implemented across all departments, and patient satisfaction scores had shown measurable improvement. But it was on a cold Tuesday evening in November that Sarah would face her greatest test, and prove definitively that the woman they had once dismissed was exactly the person they needed. The evening had started routinely enough. Sarah was working late in her office, reviewing applications for the expanded patient advocacy program she had designed, when the hospital's emergency alert system activated. Code Silver, an active threat situation requiring immediate lockdown protocols. Through her office window, Sarah could see the emergency room below as chaos erupted. Ambulances were arriving rapidly, their lights painting the parking lot in urgent red and blue. She could hear shouting and the sound of running feet in the corridors outside her office. Sarah's military training kicked in immediately. Instead of following the lockdown protocols that required civilian staff to shelter in place, she moved toward the emergency to assess the situation and determine how she could help. The scene in the emergency room was unlike anything the civilian staff had encountered. A gang-related shooting 3 blocks away had resulted in multiple casualties, including several civilians caught in the crossfire. But the real crisis had begun when members of rival gangs arrived at the hospital simultaneously, bringing their conflict into the medical center. Dr. Chun was trying to treat a gunshot victim when Sarah arrived, his hands shaking slightly as he worked under the threat of violence that permeated the room. 2 groups of young men glared at each other across the emergency room, their anger barely contained by the presence of the 2 security guards who were clearly overwhelmed by the situation. "Where's hospital security?" Sarah asked Jennifer Morrison, who was preparing supplies with efficient urgency despite the tension. "Called in sick today, understaffed," Jennifer replied tersely. "Local police are tied up with the crime scene. We're on our own until they can spare units." Sarah quickly assessed the situation with the tactical awareness that had kept her alive in combat zones. Multiple wounded requiring immediate attention, armed and angry individuals on both sides of a gang conflict, insufficient security, and medical staff who were trying to save lives while fearing for their own safety. One of the gang members, a young man with a neck tattoo and obvious gunshot wound to his shoulder, was becoming increasingly agitated as he watched Dr. Pemberton treat a rival gang member first. The medical decision was based on triage. The other patient's wounds were more life-threatening, but the gang member interpreted it as disrespect. "Why are you treating him first?" the young man demanded, approaching Pemberton's station. "I've been waiting longer." Dr. Pemberton looked up from his patient, fear evident in his eyes as he realized he was about to become the focus of gang violence. "Sir, please step back. I need to focus on this patient's injuries." "Nah, man, that's bullshit. You treating him first cause he's one of them. I see how it is." The gang member reached into his jacket, and Sarah saw the unmistakable outline of a weapon. Several staff members backed away in terror, and she could hear someone calling frantically for police backup. Without hesitation, Sarah stepped forward, placing herself between the armed young man and Dr. Pemberton. Her voice, when she spoke, carried the unmistakable tone of command that had led men and women into combat. "Stop right there." The gang member turned toward her, surprised by the interruption. "Lady, you better get out of my face before..." "Before what?" Sarah interrupted, her voice calm, but carrying an edge of steel that made the young man pause. "Before you threaten medical personnel who are trying to save your life." "You don't know what you're talking about, lady. These doctors got it out for us." Sarah studied the young man's face, seeing beneath the anger to the fear and pain underneath. She had encountered similar situations during urban operations overseas, desperate people who turned to violence because they felt powerless and unheard. "What's your name?" she asked. The question caught him off guard. "What? Your name? What do people call you?" "Marcus," he said, his hand still hovering near his weapon but his aggressive posture softening slightly. "Marcus, I'm Sarah. I work here at the hospital." Sarah's voice remained steady, professional. "I can see you're hurt and scared, and I understand why you're angry. But threatening the people who are trying to help you isn't going to get you what you need." "They ain't trying to help me. They helping him first." Marcus gestured angrily toward the patient Pemberton was treating. "Dr. Pemberton is treating him first because his injuries are more severe," Sarah explained calmly. "If your positions were reversed, they would treat you first. It's not about who you are or who you're affiliated with. It's about who needs help most urgently." Marcus wavered, clearly wanting to believe her, but struggling against years of experiences that had taught him to expect discrimination and mistreatment. Around the emergency room, both medical staff and the other gang members watched the confrontation with growing tension. "How I know you ain't lying? How I know they gonna take care of me right?" Sarah made a decision that surprised everyone in the room, including herself. "Because I'm going to personally ensure that you receive excellent medical care. And because I give you my word as someone who understands what it's like to be dismissed and mistreated by people who are supposed to help you." Something in Sarah's tone resonated with Marcus. He studied her face, seeing something there that he recognized, the look of someone who had faced genuine adversity, who understood what it meant to be written off by society. "You really gonna make sure they treat me right?" "I guarantee it," Sarah replied. "But I need you to put down any weapons and let these medical professionals do their job." The standoff lasted another 10 seconds before Marcus slowly pulled his hand away from his jacket and nodded. "All right. But if they try to play me, they won't," Sarah assured him. "Dr. Pemberton, as soon as you finish with your current patient, I want you to personally oversee Marcus's care. Make sure he receives the full attention his injuries require." Pemberton looked up from his work, clearly shaken by the confrontation but recognizing Sarah's authority in the situation. "Of course. Absolutely." Sarah turned to address the other gang members who had been watching the exchange. "The same applies to anyone else here who needs medical attention. You have my word that everyone will be treated based on their medical needs, not their affiliations or appearance." The tension in the room began to dissipate as both sides recognized that someone was taking control of the situation, someone who somehow commanded respect from all parties involved. Sarah continued to move through the emergency room, speaking briefly with each patient, assessing their needs, and ensuring that medical care proceeded without further interruption. Dr. Torres arrived 30 minutes later, having rushed to the hospital as soon as he heard about the crisis. He found Sarah coordinating with the nursing staff to ensure efficient treatment flow while keeping a careful eye on the dynamics between the rival groups. "Sarah, what's the situation?" he asked quietly. "Under control," she replied. "We've had multiple gunshot victims from a gang confrontation, but medical care is proceeding normally. No further incidents." Torres looked around the emergency room, noting the efficient way staff were working and the absence of the tension he had expected to find. "How did you manage this?" "By treating everyone like human beings who deserved medical care regardless of their circumstances," Sarah said simply. "Same principle we've been teaching in the training programs." Over the next 2 hours, Sarah continued to serve as an unofficial liaison between the medical staff and the gang members, ensuring that treatment proceeded smoothly and that no further conflicts erupted. She spoke with family members who arrived seeking information about their injured relatives, helping them navigate the hospital system and understand the medical procedures being performed. When Marcus was ready for discharge, his shoulder properly treated and his pain managed, he sought out Sarah before leaving. "Hey, Sarah," he said quietly. "I wanted to say thanks for what you did earlier." "You don't need to thank me, Marcus. Everyone deserves good medical care." "Nah, it's more than that." Marcus struggled with the words. "Most people, they see me and they make up their minds about who I am before I even open my mouth. You looked at me like I was a person, you know?" Sarah nodded. "I do know. You military or something? The way you handled that situation, the way you talked to everyone, that ain't normal." "I was Navy," Sarah confirmed. "But what happened today wasn't about military training. It was about recognizing that everyone in that room was someone's son, someone's brother, someone worthy of compassion." Marcus studied her face for a moment. "You've been through some stuff yourself, haven't you?" "We all have our stories," Sarah replied diplomatically. After Marcus left, Torres approached Sarah with an expression of profound respect. "I need to know exactly what happened here tonight. The police reports are describing this as a potential disaster that was prevented by hospital staff intervention." Sarah provided a detailed debriefing, explaining how she had recognized the escalating situation and intervened to prevent violence. She emphasized the role that bias and poor communication often played in such confrontations, and how treating all parties with dignity had been key to defusing the crisis. "Sarah, what you did tonight probably saved lives, both patients and staff," Torres said. "But you also went far beyond your job description. You put yourself at personal risk to protect others." "It's what anyone would have done in the same situation," Sarah replied. "No," Torres said firmly. "It's what someone with your specific training and character would have done. Most people would have followed lockdown protocols and waited for police backup." Word of Sarah's actions spread through the hospital within hours. Staff members who had been skeptical of her hiring began to see her in a completely different light. Here was someone who hadn't just talked about treating all patients with dignity. She had risked her own safety to ensure it happened. Dr. Chen sought her out the following morning, his admiration obvious. "I heard what you did last night. That was incredible." "It was necessary," Sarah corrected. "And it demonstrates exactly why our training programs are so important. If we treat all patients with respect and dignity from the moment they arrive, we prevent situations from escalating to crisis points." "Is that how you see it? As an extension of the training program?" Sarah considered the question carefully. "I see it as proof that the principles we're teaching work in real-world situations. When you treat people like human beings worthy of care and respect, they respond accordingly." Dr. Pemberton, who had been notably absent from conversations about Sarah's work since her hiring, approached her later that day with an expression she had never seen from him before: genuine humility. "Ms. Martinez, I wanted to speak with you about what happened last night," he began awkwardly. "Of course. I've been thinking about that situation, about how close we came to a real tragedy, and about how you prevented it." Pemberton paused, clearly struggling with words. "I've also been thinking about the night you came to our emergency room as a patient." Sarah waited quietly, allowing him to work through whatever he needed to say. "I made judgments about you based on your appearance, and those judgments were not only wrong, but potentially dangerous. If you had left that night without proper treatment, you could have suffered permanent injury. And last night, if you hadn't been there to intervene. He trailed off. Dr. Pemberton, we all make mistakes. The important thing is learning from them. I've been resistant to your training programs, he admitted. I thought they were unnecessary, politically motivated rather than medically justified. But what happened last night made me realize that how we treat patients, all patients, affects not just their health outcomes, but the safety and well-being of everyone in the hospital. Sarah nodded. That's exactly right. I'd like to request additional training for myself and my staff. Whatever programs you think would be most beneficial. It was perhaps the most significant victory Sarah had achieved since starting her new role. Dr. Pemberton's conversion from skeptic to supporter would send a message throughout the hospital that the training programs had the endorsement of even the most traditional department heads. That evening, as Sarah worked late in her office reviewing incident reports and planning follow-up training based on the previous night's events, she reflected on how much had changed since that night 6 months earlier when she had sat in the same emergency room being dismissed as worthless. The woman who had been refused proper medical care had become the woman who ensured others received compassionate treatment. The veteran who had been invisible to society had used her skills and experience to prevent violence and save lives. The patient who had been judged by her appearance had created systems to ensure others wouldn't face the same prejudice. Sarah's phone rang, interrupting her thoughts. It was Jennifer Morrison, calling from the emergency room. Sarah, we just had another situation down here. Nothing as serious as last night, but a homeless veteran having what looks like a PTSD episode. The police want to arrest him, but I think he just needs medical attention and someone who understands what he's going through. I'll be right down, Sarah said, grabbing her jacket. As she headed toward the elevator, Sarah realized that this was exactly why she was here, why her painful journey from decorated SEAL to homeless veteran to patient advocate had been necessary. Someone needed to stand between vulnerable people and a system that too often failed to see their humanity. The elevator doors closed, and Sarah prepared to once again prove that everyone deserved to be treated with dignity, regardless of their circumstances. It was a lesson she had learned the hard way, and one she would spend the rest of her career teaching others. The admission was significant, coming from the highest levels of military medical command. I'd like to invite you to consult with our medical facilities about implementing similar training programs for military healthcare providers. We owe our service members the same dignity and respect you've brought to civilian medical care. Sarah felt a profound sense of completion hearing this request. The Navy that had once been her whole world was asking for her help to better serve the men and women who were following the path she had walked. Admiral, I would be honored to help in any way I can. Over the following weeks, Sarah began developing training programs specifically for military medical facilities, adapting her civilian healthcare experience to the unique challenges of treating active duty personnel and veterans. The work felt like a homecoming, a chance to serve her military community again while using the skills and perspective she had gained through her civilian experiences. The program's first pilot implementation was at the Naval Medical Center where Sarah had received her own medical retirement processing years earlier. Standing in the same aching a difference. It validated her decision to transform her painful experience into something that could help others to find meaning in the suffering she had endured. But she also knew that changing institutional culture was a long-term process that would require sustained effort and constant vigilance. There would be resistance, setbacks, and moments when it seemed easier to return to the old ways of doing things. As Sarah worked late into the evening, reviewing feedback from the latest training session and planning improvements for the next round, she reflected on the journey that had brought her to this point. 6 months ago, she had been invisible, dismissed as worthless by the very people who now sought her guidance and expertise. The transformation wasn't just professional, it was deeply personal. For the first time since her medical retirement from the Navy, Sarah felt like she was serving a purpose larger than herself. She was using her skills and experience to make a difference, to ensure that other vulnerable people wouldn't suffer the indignities she had endured. Her phone buzzed with a text message from Jennifer Morrison, who had become both a colleague and a friend. Great session today. You're changing hearts and minds. Keep it up. Sarah smiled, filing the message away with others she had received from staff members who appreciated the work she was doing. Change was slow, but it was happening. And for someone who had once been deemed unworthy of basic medical care, being able to influence how vulnerable patients were treated felt like the most important mission she had ever been given. She thought about the Navy SEAL motto that had guided her through years of training and service. The only easy day was yesterday. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for the first time since her world had collapsed, she felt ready to face them. Outside her window, the sun was setting over the city, painting the sky in shades of orange and red. Somewhere out there, other veterans were struggling with homelessness, addiction, and the invisible wounds of service. Somewhere out there, other patients were sitting in emergency rooms being judged by their appearance rather than their humanity. Sarah Martinez, Navy SEAL, had found a new mission. Ice, gentle and reassuring, telling her that everything was going to be all right. It was a small kindness, but after the experiences of the past few hours, it felt like a lifeline back to a world where she still mattered, where she was still worth saving. In the operating room, Dr. Harrison worked with the precision and care that had made her one of the region's most respected surgeons, never knowing that the patient whose arm she was repairing had once been trained to save lives under enemy fire, never suspecting that the woman on her table had skills and experiences that would have commanded respect and admiration if only her circumstances had been different. The surgery would be successful, but the real test would come when Sarah woke up, when she had to face a world that had judged her so harshly, when she had to decide what to do with the second chance she had been given by people who didn't yet know who she really was.